I'm Melissa, 32 female. I live in a small but comfortable apartment about 3 hours away from my childhood home, a city I deliberately chose to build my own life in. As a data analyst, my world revolves around numbers and patterns, a comforting logic that felt a million miles away from the emotional chaos I grew up in. This carefully constructed piece was recently threatened by a single phone call, one that promised to drag me back into a past I thought I had escaped, all under the guise of family duty. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The call came on a Tuesday evening, a time usually reserved for a quiet dinner and streaming a new documentary. The caller ID showed Mom, and a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. My conversations with my mother, Helen, were never just casual chats. They were audits. She would methodically go through a checklist. Was I eating well? Was I saving enough money? Had I met a nice, respectable man yet? Each question was a subtle dig, a reminder that in her eyes, my independent life was a temporary arrangement, a placeholder until I fulfilled my real purpose, whatever she had decided that was. I took a deep breath and answered. "Melissa, honey," she began, her voice strained with a manufactured urgency that always set my teeth on edge. "Your father and I need to talk to you. It's important." My father, Robert, mumbled a hello in the background. A retired bank manager, he was a man of few words, preferring to let my mother steer their conversations, and by extension, their entire life. He was the silent enforcer, the stoic presence that validated her every decree. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenarios, a health scare, a financial crisis. In a way, I was right, but not in the way I expected. "Well, not really," Helen sighed dramatically. "Your father's arthritis is getting worse, you know. He could barely get the lawnmower out of the shed today. And my blood pressure, the doctor is very concerned." This was their usual opening gambit. They would catalog their various ailments, painting a picture of two frail, elderly people on the verge of collapse. My mother was 60 and my father 64. While they had health issues, they were far from helpless. They were active at their local community center, went on weekend trips, and managed their own home perfectly well. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, offering the expected sympathetic response. "Have you thought about hiring a service for the lawn, or maybe looking into a condo so you don't have to worry about maintenance?" This was a practical suggestion, a logical solution, and therefore it was immediately dismissed. "Oh, Melissa, you and your solutions," she scoffed. "This isn't a problem you can fix by throwing money at it. This is about family. Your father and I have been talking. We've done so much for you and your sister over the years. We raised you, we paid for your education, we gave you everything." The guilt trip was pulling out of the station, right on schedule. I knew where this was headed. I stayed silent, letting her build her case. It was a strategy I'd learned long ago. Arguing with her was like trying to reason with a storm. You just had to let it blow over and deal with the damage afterward. "We're not getting any younger," she continued, her voice softening into a tone of manipulative vulnerability. "And we need someone here. Jessica, bless her heart, she has her career. It's so demanding, all that social media stuff. She can't just drop everything." My sister, Jessica, was a 29-year-old social media influencer. Her demanding career consisted of taking stylized photos of herself in gifted outfits and writing captions full of inspirational quotes. She still lived only 30 minutes from our parents, yet she was always too busy for them, a fact they seemed to admire rather than resent. "What are you saying, Mom?" I asked, even though a cold dread was already creeping up my spine. "We want you to move back home, Melissa," she said, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "Your job, you work with computers, right? You can do that from anywhere. This house is too big for us to manage alone. We need you here. To help with the cooking, the cleaning, the yard work, to be here for us." I was speechless. They weren't asking me to visit more often or to help them find assistance. They were demanding I dismantle the life I had painstakingly built for myself over the last decade and revert to being their on-call daughter. Move home, I finally managed to say. Mom, I have a life here. I have a job, an apartment, friends. Friends aren't family, she cut in sharply, her soft tone gone. Your lease must be up for renewal soon, isn't it? It's perfect timing. You can move into your old room. It'll be just like old times. We need you, Melissa. It's your duty as a daughter. The word duty hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was a word my parents used often, a weapon they wielded to enforce their will. It was my duty to be quiet, to be agreeable, to put their needs before my own. My father finally spoke up, his voice a low rumble. Your mother is right, we're your parents. We took care of you. Now it's your turn to take care of us. It's the natural order of things. His words, though few, carried immense weight. They were the final judgment. There was no discussion, no negotiation. It was a verdict. I felt a surge of resentment, hot and sharp. What about Jessica? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She lives right there. Why isn't it her duty too? Helen sighed, a long-suffering sound she had perfected over the years. I already told you her work is complicated. And besides, you've always been the responsible one, the sensible one. She's more fragile. We can't put this kind of pressure on her. Fragile. Jessica was about as fragile as a bulldozer. She was willful, demanding, and had always been an expert at manipulating our parents to get exactly what she wanted. I, on the other hand, was responsible, which in my family's dictionary was a synonym for servant. Because I was capable, my needs were deemed secondary. Because I was quiet, my desires were considered non-existent. I tried to push back to explain the reality of my situation. My company requires me to be in the office 3 days a week. I can't just move. It would mean quitting my job. You'll find another one, Robert said dismissively, as if a career I had spent 8 years building was a part-time gig at a coffee shop. Or you won't need one for a while. You'll be living here rent-free. We'll take care of your expenses. The offer was presented as a kindness, but I heard it for what it was, a cage. They wanted to make me financially dependent on them again, to sever the last threads of my autonomy. The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes, my logical protests met with emotional blackmail and pronouncements of duty. I felt trapped, the walls of my own apartment closing in on me. Finally, my mother delivered the ultimatum, the final, devastating blow. Melissa, we are not asking. We are telling you, this is what needs to happen. If you choose your life over your own family, then you can consider yourself written out of it. We won't have a daughter who is so selfish, so ungrateful. Don't bother calling. Don't bother visiting. You will be on your own, truly on your own. The threat to disown me, something she had hinted at for years whenever I displeased her, was finally laid bare. It was a choice between my life and my family, and they were certain they knew which one I would choose. They had always counted on my fear of abandonment. They had raised me to believe that their approval was the only thing of value in the world. I ended the call with a non-committal, I need to think about it, my voice barely a whisper. I sank onto my couch, the silence of my apartment feeling less like peace and more like the first moments of a devastating storm. To understand the ultimatum, you have to understand my sister, Jessica. From the moment she was born, she was the sun around which our family universe revolved. I was the quiet, predictable moon, dutifully reflecting her light. Jessica was vivacious, charming, and endlessly demanding, qualities my parents interpreted as signs of a spirited and ambitious personality. My quiet, studious nature was seen as plain, serviceable, and ultimately uninteresting. Growing up, our home was a museum dedicated to her achievements. Her pageant trophies lined the mantelpiece, her art projects were framed on the walls, and her report cards, always filled with glowing comments about her bubbly personality rather than her mediocre grades, were treated like sacred texts. My own achievements were met with a polite nod. A perfect score on a math test was met with, "That's nice, dear. Now go help your sister with her diorama." Winning the state-level science fair earned me a pat on the head and a reminder not to make Jessica feel bad about her own project, which was a glitter and glue mess she'd cried over until my mother did it for her. My role was clear. I was the support system, the stagehand in the grand production of Jessica's life. This dynamic only intensified as we got older. When Jessica decided she wanted to be a photographer, my parents bought her thousands of dollars worth of camera equipment, which she used for a month before declaring it was too technical. When she decided she wanted to be a fashion designer, they paid for expensive courses she dropped out of after 2 semesters. Her every whim was funded, her every failure cushioned. My path was decidedly different. I knew from a young age that if I wanted something, I had to earn it myself. When I wanted to go to a 4-year university out of state, my parents were aghast. "Why would you want to go so far away?" Helen had asked, genuinely baffled. "The community college here is perfectly fine." They offered me no financial support, so I worked 2 jobs throughout high school, applied for every scholarship I could find, and took out student loans. My independence wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. And yet, they saw it as a rejection. The pinnacle of their favoritism was what we privately called the car incident. For my 18th birthday, I received a practical, used sedan. I was thrilled. It was freedom. 2 years later, for Jessica's 18th birthday, my father pulled into the driveway in a brand new convertible, complete with a giant red bow. When I looked at my parents, confused and hurt, my mother simply said, "Jessica just has a convertible personality, dear. You know how she loves to shine." It wasn't about need or fairness. It was about which daughter better served as a reflection of the life they wanted to project, a life of success, glamour, and beauty. I was the sensible, reliable sedan. Jessica was the flashy convertible. Her latest venture as a social media influencer was the perfect career for her. It required minimal effort for maximum praise. Her life, as curated on her profile, was a fantasy of boutique coffee shops, sponsored beach vacations, and endless positivity. My parents were her biggest fans. They would call me to breathlessly report on her latest post. "Did you see Jessica in that dress? She has over 2,000 likes." Helen would chirp. "She's making a real name for herself." They had no idea that most of her designer clothes were bought and returned after the photos were taken, or that the vacations were often weekend trips funded by their bank account. They saw what they wanted to see: a perfect, successful daughter. After their ultimatum, I spent a week in a fog of anxiety and anger. I replayed every conversation, every instance where I was made to feel like I was second best, like my only value was in my utility. The threat of being disowned was terrifying, a deep, primal fear they had expertly cultivated in me. Was I really going to throw away my entire family? But what kind of family was it? It was a system, an economy in which my love and labor were expected, while Jessica's mere existence was celebrated. I felt an immense pressure to give in. It was the path of least resistance, the role I had been trained my whole life to play. Sacrifice your needs, Melissa. Keep the peace, Melissa. Be the responsible one, Melissa. I decided to call Jessica, hoping for a shred of solidarity. It was a foolish hope, but I was desperate. I found her in the middle of a very important live stream where she was unboxing a new brand of vegan leather handbags. "Can I call you back?" she whispered into the phone, annoyance clear in her voice. "I'm working." I insisted, and she finally sighed and ended her stream. "What is so important, Mel?" she snapped. I explained the situation, the phone call, the demands, the threat. I told her I was scared and didn't know what to do. I was hoping she'd say, "That's crazy, I'll talk to them." Or even, "That's so unfair to you." Instead, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Well, they do need help, and Mom is right, your job is more flexible than mine." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Flexible? Jessica, I have a career, you take pictures for a living." "Don't diminish my work," she shot back, her voice icy. "I'm a brand, it's a lot of pressure. And honestly, Melissa, it would probably be good for you. You're always so stressed out about money and your job. Moving home would solve all your problems. You wouldn't have to pay rent." She was parroting their exact words. It wasn't just that she was siding with them, she was actively part of the campaign. She saw it as a perfectly reasonable solution because it had no negative impact on her. In fact, it would benefit her. With me at home handling our parents, she would be free from any lingering guilt or responsibility. She could continue her fantasy life uninterrupted. "So you think I should just quit my job and give up my life to become their full-time, unpaid nurse?" I asked, my voice rising. "Don't be so dramatic," she said with a sigh. "It's not like that. It's just helping out. It's what family does. You're just being selfish." Selfish. The word they always used to put me back in my box. If I wanted anything for myself, I was selfish. If I had boundaries, I was selfish. It was the ultimate condemnation in our family's twisted moral code. That conversation was the breaking point. It clarified everything. I wasn't just fighting my parents' expectations. I was fighting an entire family system designed to serve one person, Jessica. My mother, my father, and now my sister, they were a united front. And I was completely and utterly out. One, the fear of being disowned was still there, but now it was joined by a new feeling, a cold, hard anger. They had left me no choice. If I gave in, I would cease to exist. I would become a function, a tool, a means to an end. The thought terrified me more than the thought of being alone. After a week of sleepless nights and crippling indecision, I made a choice. Or rather, a partial one. I called my parents back and told them I would consider their proposal, but I couldn't make such a life-altering decision over the phone. I needed to come down for a weekend to talk things through and to assess the situation, as I put it in my most professional data analyst voice. This was a lie, of course. My real intention was to buy myself time and to confront them in person, hoping that face-to-face, they might see me as a human being rather than a solution to their problems. It was a flimsy hope, but it was all I had. They were delighted, taking my visit as a sign of my imminent surrender. "Of course, dear, that's so sensible," my mother cooed. "We'll see you on Saturday." When I arrived, the house was exactly as I remembered it, immaculately clean, every object in its place, a perfect facade of domestic tranquility. My mother greeted me with a hug that felt more like an inspection, her eyes scanning me for any signs of defiance. My father gave me his standard awkward pat on the shoulder. They had prepared my favorite dinner, a classic move from their manipulation playbook. Phase 1, love bombing. The weekend was a masterclass in passive aggression. Every conversation was laced with hints about how difficult their lives had become. "Oh, my back is so stiff," my father would groan while reaching for the salt. "I really shouldn't be climbing that ladder to clean the gutters this year." My mother would sigh dramatically while dusting the shelves in the living room. "This house is just so much work. I don't know how much longer we can keep it up." They spoke of their home as both a precious legacy they couldn't bear to leave and an unbearable burden they could no longer manage. The unspoken message was clear. This burden was now mine to carry. They had also made a point of clearing out my old bedroom, which had been used for storage. The single bed was made up with the same childish floral comforter I'd had since I was 16. It was a deliberate, calculated gesture designed to infantilize me, to remind me of my place as their child, not an independent adult. I felt like I was shrinking with every hour I spent there. On Sunday morning, my mother asked me to do her a small favor. She wanted me to go through the filing cabinet in my father's home office and organize some old financial statements. "Your father's hands are just too stiff for all that paperwork," she said with a wave of her hand. "And you're so good with details." It was a test, a way to ease me into my new role as their household manager. I agreed, partly to be helpful, but mostly because I was curious. My father, the retired bank manager, was meticulous about his finances. The idea that his files were in disarray seemed highly unlikely. The office was his sanctuary, a place of order and control. The filing cabinet was a heavy, old-fashioned metal thing, the drawers packed tight with neatly labeled folders. Taxes, mortgage, car insurance, investments. It was exactly as organized as I expected. As I worked my way through, sorting documents by year, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was my element: data, order, facts. It was in the bottom drawer, tucked away in a folder simply marked personal, that I found it. The folder contained their birth certificates, our old passports, and a few other miscellaneous documents. Underneath them was a thick, glossy brochure and a sheaf of papers held together with a binder clip. The brochure was from a major life insurance company. The paperwork was a copy of a new policy. It had been taken out just 6 months ago. My heart started to beat a little faster. It made sense. They were getting older. Updating their insurance was a responsible thing to do. I scanned the first page, my eyes catching the policy amount. It was substantial. Enough to pay off their remaining mortgage, cover all final expenses, and leave a very comfortable inheritance. I felt a pang of guilt for snooping, but my curiosity was stronger. I flipped to the section detailing the beneficiaries. My father, Robert, was listed as the primary insured, with my mother, Helen, as the first beneficiary. That was standard. Then came the contingent beneficiary, the person who would inherit if both of them passed away at the same time. My hands started to tremble as I read the name typed in the box. It wasn't my name, and it wasn't split between me and my sister. The sole contingent beneficiary, entitled to 100% of the massive payout, was Jessica. I read it again and again. The words didn't change. Jessica, sole beneficiary. I felt the air leave my lungs, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. It was like I'd been punched in the gut. All their talk of family, of duty, of needing me, of us being a single unit, it was all a lie. In the single most important financial decision of their later life, the one that looked toward the future after they were gone, I didn't exist. I was not part of their legacy. I was just the help. The unpaid labor they were trying to secure to make their lives more comfortable in the present. My role was to sacrifice my life so they could live out their years in ease. And in the end, everything they had would go to their perfect, shining daughter, the one who was too fragile to be burdened with their care. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The sudden urgency to get me to move home, the talk about my flexible job, the threat of disowning me, it was all a calculated strategy. They were threatening to cut me out of a family that had already, in practice, written me off. The disinheritance wasn't a future threat. It was a present reality, hidden in black and white in a filing cabinet. They wanted me to give up my career, my home, and my future to become their caretaker, and my compensation would be nothing. I wouldn't even have the security of an inheritance that my service was meant to protect. My service was meant to protect Jessica's inheritance. I was to be the guardian of her golden parachute, sacrificing my own financial and personal well-being to ensure she would be comfortable for the rest of her life. I carefully placed the documents back in the folder, my movements precise and mechanical. My hands were steady now, the trembling replaced by an icy calm. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound, but it was being rapidly overtaken by a powerful, clarifying rage. They had underestimated me. They saw me as the dutiful, compliant daughter who would crumble at the first sign of their disapproval. They had no idea who I really was. They didn't know that the same analytical mind that could find patterns in complex data sets could also see the pattern here. I walked out of the office, closing the door softly behind me. My face was a neutral mask, betraying none of the turmoil inside. The game had changed. They thought they were holding all the cards, but I had just found their tell, and I was going to use it to burn their whole house of cards to the ground. I went through the rest of that Sunday on autopilot, a hollowed-out version of myself. I made pleasant conversation, helped my mother with dinner, and listened to my father's complaints about the state of politics. On the surface, I was the dutiful daughter, thoughtfully considering their offer. Inside, I was a detective at a crime scene, and the victims were my own illusions. The life insurance policy was the smoking gun, but I knew it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. My data analyst brain kicked into high gear, overriding the emotional storm. I needed more information. I needed to understand the full scope of their deception before I made my next move. That night, after they had gone to bed, I crept back into the office. I had my laptop with me. My father, for all his meticulousness with paper files, was surprisingly lax with his digital security. His password was a combination of my mother's name and their anniversary, predictable. I logged into his computer, my heart pounding in my ears. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I felt it was a necessary act of self-preservation. They had declared a war on my future. I was simply gathering intelligence. I started with their bank accounts. My father had everything linked: checking, savings, investment portfolios. The numbers were staggering. They weren't just comfortable, they were wealthy. Their retirement savings were robust, their investments had performed well, and they had almost no debt. The picture they had painted of two frail seniors struggling to get by was a complete fabrication. They could have afforded a full-time, live-in nurse, a personal chef, and a landscaping crew without making a dent in their principal. Their plea wasn't born of necessity, it was born of greed. They simply didn't want to spend their own money on their care. They had a free option, me. Then I started looking at the outgoing transfers, and that's when the true picture of their deceit began to form. There were regular, substantial payments to an account under Jessica's name, thousands of dollars every single month. It was far more than just helping out with a few bills. They were funding her entire life. I cross-referenced the dates of the transfers with Jessica's social media posts. The $5,000 transfer in March. That corresponded with her spontaneous, week-long trip to an all-inclusive resort in Mexico. The $3,000 in May, that was the week she posted about her fabulous shopping spree for a new summer wardrobe. Her car payment, her apartment rent, her credit card bills, it was all being paid by them. Jessica wasn't a successful, self-made influencer. She was a 29-year-old woman on her parents' payroll. Her entire brand was a lie, bankrolled by the retirement fund I was being guilted into protecting. The anger that had been simmering inside me began to boil. They weren't just favoring her, they were enabling a complete fiction at my expense. They were asking me, the daughter who had worked for everything she had, to give up my financial independence to care for them, while they were simultaneously pouring money into a fantasy life for the daughter who had never worked an honest day in her life. I dug deeper, searching through their emails. I found the correspondence with their financial advisor. In one email, my mother had written, "We need to ensure Jessica is taken care of, no matter what. Her line of work is not stable, and we want to provide her with a safety net. Melissa is different. She is self-sufficient and responsible. She'll always be fine on her own." There it was again, my capability being used as a justification to abandon me. My strength was my punishment. Because I could stand on my own 2 feet, they felt no obligation to support me. In their minds, I didn't need them, so they didn't need to consider me. The most damning evidence came from an email chain between my parents and their lawyer from 6 months prior. Around the same time, they took out the new insurance policy. The subject line was estate planning update. My father had written, "Following our discussion, we want to formally update our will. We wish to leave the house and all remaining assets solely to Jessica. We will rely on Melissa's goodwill to provide care for us in our later years. Her contribution will be her time and effort, not financial." My mother had added, "This is the fairest way. Jessica needs the financial security. Melissa has her career." I felt sick to my stomach. It was a premeditated, coordinated plan. They had sat down with a lawyer and methodically stripped me from their legacy. They had decided that my inheritance would be the honor of serving them. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They weren't just thoughtless, they were strategic. They had weighed their 2 daughters and decided that one was an asset to be invested in and the other was a resource to be exploited. I saved copies of everything, the bank statements, the transfer records, the emails, uploading them to a secure cloud drive. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was a calculated attempt to defraud me of my time, my labor, and my future. As the first light of dawn began to break, I logged out of the computer, leaving no trace of my digital intrusion. I walked back to my childhood bedroom, the floral comforter looking more sinister than ever. I felt like a stranger in my own family, an outsider who had finally been shown the truth. The hurt was still there, a raw, open wound, but the confusion and self-doubt were gone. I was no longer wrestling with guilt or a sense of duty. I was armed with facts, with evidence. I saw the full picture now, every hidden transaction, every secret email, every lie. The emotional fog had lifted, revealing a stark, clear path forward. I wasn't going to cry or yell or plead my case. I was going to treat this like one of my data projects. I had gathered the information. I had analyzed the patterns. Now, it was time to build my model. It was time to make a plan. I drove home that afternoon in a state of hyper-focused calm. The 3-hour drive was a blur of highway and trees, but in my mind, a complex strategy was taking shape. My initial instinct had been to confront them immediately, to throw their hypocrisy in their faces and walk away forever. But I quickly realized that would be letting them off too easily. A dramatic exit would give them the moral high ground. They could paint me as the ungrateful, hot-headed daughter who flew off the handle. They would become the victims, and I, the villain. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. My revenge wouldn't be loud and explosive. It would be quiet, methodical, and delivered in a language they would understand. The language of contracts and consequences. My father, the former bank manager, and my mother, the former real estate agent, lived their lives by the letter of the law, by the fine print on a document. They believed in binding agreements. So, I would give them one. For the next 2 weeks, I dedicated my evenings to my new project. I channeled all my anger, hurt, and analytical skill into drafting a document I titled the Familial Care and Household Management Agreement. It was a masterpiece of cold, corporate precision. I researched market rates for every service they had demanded of me. I looked up the average salaries for in-home caregivers, personal chefs, housekeepers, property managers, and chauffeurs in their specific zip code. I calculated the costs down to the hour. The contract was structured into several key sections. The scope of services section was brutally specific. It listed every task they had mentioned. Meal preparation for 3 meals per day, adhering to specified dietary restrictions. Weekly deep cleaning of a 2,500 square foot residence. Lawn maintenance and seasonal garden care. Transportation to and from all medical appointments and social engagements. And on-call availability for emergencies, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The next section was compensation. I didn't ask for an inheritance or a share of the estate. I treated it as a job because that's exactly what it was. I calculated the total hours required per week, a conservative estimate of 60, and multiplied it by the blended hourly rate I had researched. The resulting monthly salary was significant. To this, I added sections for benefits, health insurance coverage, since I would be quitting my job, paid vacation, 4 weeks per year to be taken at my discretion, and sick leave. I also included a clause for an annual performance review and a cost of living salary increase tied to inflation. But the most important section, the one I spent the most time on, was titled Terms and Conditions. This is where I laid my trap. Clause 1. The agreement would be legally binding, notarized, and reviewed by a lawyer of my choosing, at their expense. Clause 2. Compensation was to be paid on the first of every month via direct deposit. Any late payment would incur a 10% penalty. Clause 3. A termination clause. I could terminate the contract with 30 days' notice for any reason. They could only terminate the contract for gross negligence, the definition of which was spelled out in excruciating detail. A simple disagreement or a change of heart was not sufficient cause. Clause 4. This was the masterstroke. I added a full disclosure clause. It stated that for the contract to be valid, they must provide a complete and verified statement of their current assets, liabilities, and all existing estate planning documents, including wills and life insurance policies. The clause specified that this disclosure was necessary for me to fully understand the long-term financial context of the agreement. This would force them to put the insurance policy and the will on the table. They would either have to lie on a legal document, committing fraud, or they would have to admit the truth. Finally, I added a signature page for myself, Robert, and Helen. The entire document was 12 pages long, written in dense, impenetrable legalese that I had carefully adapted from online templates. It was cold, impersonal, and utterly ironclad. It was a reflection of the relationship they had offered me, transactional, devoid of genuine love or care. I was simply giving them what they wanted, but with a price tag attached. While I was drafting the contract, I also took other steps. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in elder and family law. I paid for a 1-hour consultation, showed her the document, and explained the situation in broad strokes without the emotional details. She reviewed the contract and pronounced it aggressively thorough and perfectly legal. She made a few minor tweaks to the wording to strengthen its enforceability. Her validation was a relief. This wasn't just an emotional outburst. It was a sound legal strategy. 2 weeks after my visit, my mother called, her voice dripping with impatience. "Melissa, we haven't heard from you. We assumed you'd be starting to pack by now. Your father and I have been waiting." "I've been giving your offer a lot of thought," I said, my voice calm and even. "I've decided to accept, but under certain conditions. I've prepared a formal agreement to ensure we're all on the same page regarding expectations. I'd like to come down this weekend to discuss it with you, Dad, and Jessica. It's important she's there too, so the whole family is aligned." My mother was momentarily speechless. This was not part of her script. "Agreement?" she stammered. "What on earth are you talking about? We're family, not a business." "I think it's important to be clear and professional about this," I replied smoothly. "It's a big commitment and I want to make sure I can provide the best possible care for you. Having everything in writing protects all of us. I'll see you on Saturday at noon." Before she could argue, I hung up. The plan was in motion. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. I arrived at my parents' house at exactly noon on Saturday. I was dressed not in my usual weekend jeans, but in a sharp business casual outfit, dark trousers, a silk blouse, and a blazer. I carried a leather portfolio containing 4 copies of the Familial Care and Household Management Agreement. I was no longer coming to them as a daughter, but as a prospective service provider. My demeanor was calm, polite, and completely detached. They were all waiting for me in the living room. My mother, Helen, perched on the edge of the sofa, looking anxious. My father, Robert, in his armchair, affecting an air of patriarchal authority, and my sister, Jessica, scrolling through her phone, looking bored and annoyed that her weekend had been interrupted. "Melissa, what is all this nonsense about a contract?" My mother began immediately, foregoing any pleasantries. "Your father and I are very confused." "It's not nonsense, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "It's a professional arrangement. You've asked me to give up my career, my home, and my personal life to take on a full-time job. It's only sensible that we treat it as such." I walked to the coffee table and placed a copy of the agreement in front of each of them. "I'd like you all to read this carefully." My father picked it up, his brow furrowed as he scanned the first page. Jessica didn't even look at it. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "We're family. You don't make family sign contracts. When family asks you to sacrifice your entire future for their comfort, you do," I replied, looking directly at her. My tone was so devoid of its usual warmth that it made her look up from her phone. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustling of paper as my parents read through the document. I watched their faces. My mother's initial confusion morphed into disbelief, then indignation. My father's expression hardened into a mask of cold anger. He was a man used to being in control, and this document wrested all control from him. Finally, he slammed it down on the table. "This is an insult," he seethed, his voice low and dangerous. "A salary, health insurance, paid vacation. What do you think this is?" "It's a job description," I said calmly. "Everything in that contract is standard for the services you've requested. In fact, I've priced my labor very competitively." "Competitively?" my mother shrieked, finding her voice. "You're demanding we pay you a fortune to be our daughter. What about love? What about duty?" "What about it?" I shot back, my composure finally cracking just a little. "Was it love and duty that led you to write me out of your will? Was it love and duty that made you name Jessica the sole beneficiary of your life insurance policy after demanding I be the one to care for you?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if I had detonated a bomb in the middle of the room. Jessica's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. My mother's face went pale, and she opened and closed her mouth like a fish. My father's angry facade crumbled, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. He knew exactly what I was talking about. I don't know what you mean," my mother stammered, looking to my father for help, but he refused to meet her gaze. "Oh, I think you do," I said, my voice now as cold as ice. "I'm referring to policy number 74B912, issued 6 months ago, the one where everything goes to Jessica. Or maybe we should talk about your updated estate plan, the one where my inheritance is the goodwill of taking care of you for free." I let the words hang in the air, enjoying the suffocating tension that filled the room. Jessica turned to our parents. What is she talking about? Is that true? My mother just stared at me, her expression a mixture of fear and fury. You went through our private papers, she whispered, her voice trembling. That's a terrible violation of our trust. My trust was violated long before that, I retorted. It was violated when you decided my entire life was disposable. It was violated when you conspired to use me as free labor to protect her financial future. I gestured towards Jessica, who now looked thoroughly unnerved. You demanded I sacrifice everything, with the threat of disowning me hanging over my head, all while you had already written me off. You lied to me. You tried to manipulate and exploit me. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, intense level. So here is my counteroffer. You want my care, you will pay for it, at market rate, you will provide benefits, and you will agree to every single term in this contract. That includes the full financial disclosure clause. I want to see every asset, every account, and every document, all verified by my lawyer. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. This is blackmail. No, I corrected him. This is business, you taught me that. You look for the best deal, you protect your assets. I am simply protecting mine. And my most valuable asset is my future, which you tried to steal. I stood up. You have two options. You can sign this contract, and I will become the most efficient, professional caregiver you could ever hope to find. Or you can refuse. If you refuse, I will walk out that door, and you will never see or hear from me again. Your threat of disowning me is meaningless because you already did it. The only difference is that now, it will be on my terms. Jessica finally flew. ND her voice. Mom, Dad, just sign it, she pleaded, a note of panic in her voice. She wasn't concerned for them. She was realizing that if I walked away, the burden of their care, or at least the guilt of avoiding it, might fall to her. More importantly, if they had to pay me, there would be less money to fund her lifestyle. My mother looked at the contract, then at me, her eyes filled with a venomous hatred I had never seen before. Never, she spat. I will never pay my own daughter to be a part of this family. Fine, I said, picking up my portfolio. Then we have nothing more to discuss. I turned and walked toward the front door. For a fleeting second, I thought my father might stop me. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, maybe, or just the shock of losing control. But he remained silent. It was my mother who had the last word. You will regret this, Melissa, she screamed at my back. You will die alone. I paused at the door, but I didn't turn around. No, Mom, I said softly, more to myself than to her. I'm finally going to live. And with that, I opened the door and walked out into the sunshine, leaving the ruins of my family behind me. The first few weeks after I walked out of that house were surreal. I expected to feel a crushing weight of grief or guilt, but instead, what I felt was an overwhelming, almost dizzying sense of lightness. It was as if I had been carrying a massive, invisible backpack my entire life, and I had finally set it down. The constant hum of anxiety in the back of my mind, the low-grade dread before every phone call from my mother, the gnawing feeling of being perpetually undervalued, it was all gone. The silence was profound. Of course, it wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt that crept in during the quiet hours of the night. Had I been too harsh? Had I destroyed my family over money? But then I would remember the cold, calculated words in my father's email or the dismissive tone in Jessica's voice, and the clarity would return. This was never about money. It was about respect. It was about my right to exist as a person outside of my function to them. They had given me an ultimatum, their way or the highway. I had simply chosen the highway, and to my surprise, the view was beautiful. I blocked their numbers. I blocked Jessica on all social media. I sent a formal, brief email to my parents, address stating that my decision was final and that any further attempts to contact me would be ignored. I needed a clean break, a period of absolute silence to heal and rediscover who I was without their constant influence. I threw myself into my work with a renewed passion. Without the emotional drain of my family drama, I had so much more energy and focus. I took on a challenging new project at my firm, one that involved complex predictive modeling. I worked long hours, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. My mind, free from its old burdens, felt sharp and alive. I received a promotion and a significant raise within 6 months. The irony was not lost on me. By refusing to sacrifice my career, I had made it flourish more than ever before. I also invested in myself. I started seeing a therapist to unpack the decades of emotional manipulation I had endured. It was painful work, but it was also liberating. I learned to set boundaries in all areas of my life. I reconnected with old friends I had drifted away from, and I made new ones. I started hiking on the weekends, exploring the trails outside the city, and finding a sense of peace in nature that I had never known. I was building a life that was truly my own, one based on my own values and desires, not on someone else's expectations or needs. About a year after the confrontation, I received a letter from a cousin on my father's side. She was a kind woman who had always remained neutral in our family's dynamics. Her letter was cautious but informative. She told me that things at my parents' house had changed. Without me to manage their lives, they had been forced to confront the reality of their situation. They had hired a cleaning service, which they complained about constantly. They had a lawn service, which they felt was overpriced. My father had a paid caregiver come in a few times a week to help him, a cheerful woman my mother apparently despised out of jealousy. But the biggest change was with Jessica. With me out of the picture, the pressure had subtly shifted to her. My parents, now spending their own money on their care, had significantly cut back on her allowance. Her influencer career, which had been propped up by their endless funding, began to crumble. Her posts became less frequent, the sponsored trips ceased, and the designer clothes disappeared. According to my cousin, Jessica had been forced to get a part-time job in retail. She was reportedly furious, complaining to anyone who would listen that her life was ruined because her selfish sister had abandoned the family. The news didn't bring me the burst of triumphant joy I might have once expected. Instead, I just felt a quiet sense of validation. It was the natural consequence of their own actions. They had built a dysfunctional system, and I had simply refused to be the load-bearing wall anymore. The entire structure had collapsed under the weight of its own unsustainability. They were now living in the world they had created, a world of transactions and resentments. Last month, I bought my own place. It's a small 2-bedroom condo with a balcony overlooking a park. It's the first thing I have ever owned that is entirely mine. As I was unpacking my boxes, I found an old photo album. I flipped through pictures of my childhood, me, a serious-looking girl with glasses, always standing slightly behind Jessica, who was always in the center, smiling brightly for the camera. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for that little girl who tried so hard to earn the love that was given so freely to her sister. But I didn't linger on it. I closed the album and put it away. That little girl wasn't me anymore. I am not defined by my family's rejection. I am defined by my own choices, my own work, my own friendships, and my own home. My life isn't loud or flashy like the one my parents wanted for my sister. It's quiet, it's stable, and it's built on a foundation of self-respect. They threatened to leave me with nothing, but in the end, they gave me the greatest gift of all, the freedom to design a life of my own. And for that, I am truly grateful.